Buchholz Plant Introductions, Part 15. Maples in the morning, maples in the evening, maples at supper time. I often reflect that I was born independently wealthy. I would have never operated a wholesale nursery that produced and sold maples. It would have been more fun to give them away. No need to breed for desirable characteristics at Buchholz Nursery. Rather simply harvest seed from named varieties in an open garden setting, and nature will reward the plantsman with a bounty of wonders. Don't go looking for something. Better to let that something find you. I have germinated thousands of such seedlings, and the problem is that so many of them become my special projects. And I tend to champion every tree for its unique qualities. Try to squeeze in that obsession with the challenges of running a profitable company. Well, I did it anyways. And as you know, many random seedlings have proven to be commercial winners. I admit that it is rewarding to find some of them now commonplace in the trade. The Mr. Maple Company from North Carolina recently produced a 2-part YouTube video. You can find it on the internet, entitled The Top 50 Buchholz Maple Introductions. The countdown to number 1 was fun for me, to see how a nationally famous mail-order company rated my babies. I won't give away their favorite, their number 1. You can watch for yourself. But I was surprised, very surprised, that Acer Palmatum Fairy here didn't even make it into the top 50. Of course, it is similar to the music top 50 countdown, where no two people will likely agree. Nevertheless, I was a bit embarrassed that my introduction surpassed the 50 count. I didn't realize that there had been so many, as I had no intention to hog the limelight. I remember back to about 2006 when Greenhouse 15 was jammed with a couple thousand maple seedlings, and all those displayed at least initial promise. The seedlings that were called for looking just like ordinary Acer Palmatum were moved elsewhere, and later became rootstock. The interesting group was further sorted a year later. And so the process continued. Hardly a day passed when I didn't walk through the greenhouse to enjoy its sights, and I preferred to wander alone in peace without the noise and bustle of the employees. Over the years, strange-looking seedlings kept calling out to me, and eventually, the Acer Palmatum Amber Ghost offspring was named and propagated as Bloody Talons. See Buchholz Plant Introductions Part 6 for a recap of that story. Another maple seedling that impressed me year after year was a green upright where the fresh spring leaves emerged with bright cherry red tips. It was a crowd favorite with customers and visitors when I paraded them through the greenhouse, and later it was christened Diva, from Latin via Italian for divine. I fell in love with the beauty, but her charm in spring would fade by June in the greenhouse, when the red leaf tips evolved to purple, then to a faint purple by July. And for the remainder of the growing season, there was no apparent justification for its selection. When I was about to shrug her off for good, she would dazzle me with scarlet red in October, November. Such a diva indeed. Then she practically coos. See me again in the spring. There are a lot of plants that I no longer grow. I thought about that the other day when I walked past my huge specimen of Acer Palmatum, Benny Sheehan. My original tree was gifted to me by the late Harold Johnston of Alabama, who discovered and introduced it, when he went a step further and even patented it. But at least he allowed me to propagate the cultivar freely, without messing with the patent burden. Harold called his finding a once-in-a-lifetime discovery, and it originated as a branch mutation on a red upright palmatum. The Japanese name translated as red-purple smoke, and the leaf lobes are rather narrow and slightly sickle-shaped, with light cream white margins. I discontinued it at least 10 years ago because of its propensity to revert back to its bloodgood-like origin. I once had a row of 8 stock trees 5 to 6 foot tall, And when my back was turned, 5 of them produced sizable reversions, where pruning would have ruined the tree's shapes, so I threw those 5 away. I confess that I sold the 3 remaining before they became worthless, so there might be a place for me in the plant hell for doing so. Maybe the reversion issue is not the cultivar's fault, though. It could be that I pushed them too fast with water and fertilizer, except that my original specimen in the display garden also has a large reverted portion which I still haven't found time to deal with. I never met Mr. Johnson in person, but we would talk maples a couple times a year on the telephone, and we traded cultivars. He was a salty old cuss who wasn't afraid to state his elderly opinions, and I found his low-keyed sense of humor to be entertaining. For a number of years, he would send me a 5-pound bag of pecans at Christmas time, and I'm talking 5 pounds of shelled pecans. I could imagine him sitting on the front porch cracking the damn thing into the night, maybe with a cup of moonshine for company. I decided that I would visit his Alabama nursery one day, but I never carved out the time to do so, which I now deeply regret. Not to be outdone, a nurseryman from Saitama Prefecture, Japan, introduced Acer palmatum Shinhikasa in 1984, according to the maple expert Masayoshi Yano, in Book for Maples, but it wasn't available, or perhaps even known in America, when Abigail Rose and Squiddy were in the trade. Shinhikasa has a couple synonyms like Shinhikasa Yama, but the word Shin means new, and Hikasa, or Hikasa Yama, refers to Hikasa Mountain. The old cultivar Acer palmatum Hikasa Yama was perhaps the seed parent of the new dwarf, and in Japanese the letters G and K are often interchanged. So, we now have 3 clones, 2 from America and 1 from Japan. And to me, they look completely alike. I chuckle at the poorly translated Japanese to English in the Yano book, where the author wanted to say that Shinhikasa was not problem-free to grow. The translation came out, it's difficult to grow without cultural techniques. Well, thanks for that, but we already know. Acer palmatum Alyan was a seedling found by Alyan Garfius, who was employed by Buchholz Nursery in about 2000. He worked for 2 summers while in high school, a bright, happy boy who quickly made friends with everyone. He was on the crew that was preparing Acer palmatum rootstock for grafting when he pulled out a colorful seedling that resembled the well-known cultivar, Acer palmatum Orido no Nishiki. I remember the day that Alyan brought it to me after work, and his delight with his discovery was evidenced by his infectious smile. I congratulated him and explained this is exactly how new cultivars from seedlings arise. And I commented that if it proved a worthy selection, then I would name it Alyan. It was, and I did. But note that the maple was named Alyan with an A, when it should have been spelled Alyan with an O. So, for both summers, when he worked for me, my less than stellar office staff used the wrong spelling for his name on his paychecks and on all other government forms. 10 years ago, when he came back to visit the nursery, I asked him why he never said anything about his name. He replied that he could still cash the paychecks and it was no big deal at the time. Well, it was for me, since I had named and sold a cultivar for a number of years already, and it was a disappointment that we screwed up the name in his honor. Again, he just smiled. At the time Acer palmatum Alyan was discovered, Buchholz Nursery was at its peak of maple production, with about 150,000 grafts per year. Most were sold to other Oregon wholesale nurseries, with one company custom ordering between 60 to 80,000 per year. Pressure was on Buchholz because we used their rootstocks and their scions, and the profit margin was too small to accommodate any significant failure. It was probably in those years that my hair evolved from brown to gray. but I was still having fun with interesting seedlings and selections. The Alyan saga caused me to reflect that the young boy's discovery was the first time that anyone at Buchholz Nursery was involved with a plant selection, besides myself. The second time was years later with Dulce Jimenez's discovery of Acer palmatum dulce, described in Part 13. Nursery work can be repetitive drudgery often performed in adverse weather conditions. The nursery workers, and I've employed many hundreds of them, develop their own individual strategies to survive the ordeal. Desiring more involvement and inspiration from the staff, I charged all 30 or so to spend the last hour of one Friday and search through our 100,000 seedlings to find something interesting or unique, just as Alyan had done, and to put their name on their selection. No one really embraced the project, but I championed each choice for its qualities, just like a grade school teacher praises every child in the class for their uninspired art or poetry. Out of the lot, I did find one crinkled foliage seedling to be of interest, and I temporarily tagged it Katie's Crinkle after the finder. Katie was a college graduate from the South, y'all, but her behavioral excesses with the vegan religion, heavy tobacco and weed consumption, combined with bipolar disorder, led to an early termination. Still, I liked her maple selection, and eventually we began to propagate it. I changed the name to Kinky Crinkle, and thus it was included in the Vertrees Gregory Japanese maple publication. Therein, it is described as intermediate between the palmatum type, Tsukugumo, and the Matsumura type, Shigure-bato. At one point, I sent a start to maple grower Karen Junker of England, but apparently I had a mental lapse with the name Kinky Crinkle, and I referred to it as Crazy Crinkle, as employee Katie was certainly both. Miss Junker didn't care for either name, for which I can't blame her, but I explained its origin, and that the college girl had a large, ugly octopus tattooed on her back with two tentacles reaching around her body to capture both bingo and bango. Acer palmatum Kokyo was a Buchholz introduction from the mid-1990s, and my start came from a scionwood of mature, at the time unnamed seedling growing in the renowned garden of Jane Platt, Portland, Oregon. It was a sturdy, broad canopied tree with green foliage that featured reddish new growth in spring and summer, but then Miss Platt vowed it would explode with fiery orange-red in autumn. I checked judgment as advice. Then when I revisited at the end of October, I was overwhelmed with a brilliant red orb that throbbed in her predominantly green scape. How apropos that her sunball actually originated in Japan, the land of the rising sun. As the story goes, Miss Platt's sister, also a gardener, was touring the Emperor's Palace garden called Kokyo Gein in fall in Tokyo, and helped herself to seed from one flaming red tree. I was allowed to propagate from the Platt tree, and took the liberty to apply the name Kokyo, since I had to call it something, at least temporarily, so that I could keep track of it. Years later, I also visited the imperial estate with my Japanese wife, Haruko, and I kept an eye on the lookout for the original specimen. Unfortunately, I couldn't distinguish it from the dozens of other well-groomed maples, especially since we were visiting in spring. The garden experience was somewhat compromised by the piercing light at midday, and I wish we could have toured nearer the sunrise or at sunset. Black pines, Pinus thunbergii, or Kuromatsu, were particularly contained by our oriental pruning techniques, but their glimmerous needles were very tiring in my jet-lag condition. Nevertheless, I was treated to the perfect example of Como Rebai, leaking light. When I looked up to the canopy of a large, towering Acer palmatum, the Japanese people have a mindset where the actual leaves and the branches surrender to the emanating light that leaks between them. What isn't becomes the vision. If you are a specialty nursery or boutique garden center wanting the rare and exceptional plants your customers love, register as a wholesale customer on buchholznursery.com today.